I hate you. I wish you were dead. You're so stupid. You're worthless. I wish you had never been born. I wish you weren't my parents. Have you ever uttered any of those statements? Have you ever thought any of those statements? If we're being honest, we all have stated something to that effect at some time in our life. We've either spoken those hateful, hurtful words, or we've thought them. And yet, typically what happens is that we will dismiss that, won't we? After the effect, after it takes place, maybe our temper has cooled off. We'll kind of dismiss it as, you just make me so angry at times. Or, hey, I lost my temper again. I didn't really mean it. Or even the worst. I was just joking, right? While it's tempting to minimize our angry words, thoughts, and attitudes, the truth is that there can be danger in anger. And this is fitting since anger is only one letter away from danger. In one of the old Peanuts comic strips, Charles Schulz shows Sally trying to locate her memory verse for Sunday school. She had forgotten it, and she couldn't locate it in the Bible. She's lost in her thoughts, trying to remember what this memory verse is, when suddenly she says, maybe it was something in the book of reevaluation. Well, Sally's butchering of the book of Revelation is appropriate in this setting. For the entire Bible is indeed aimed at getting us to reevaluate our lives. Here in our text, in verses 21 through 26, Jesus forces us to reevaluate our concept of anger. And in these 6 verses, Jesus imparts 2 exhortations that will help us have healthy relationships. Basically, what he tells us to do is to nurture and esteem our relationships. And the first way that we do that, we see in verses 21 through 22, where we need to recognize that unrighteous anger is murder. Unrighteous anger is murder. Remember back in verse 20, Jesus said that our righteousness has to surpass that of the scribes and Pharisees. And as I said earlier, now we see him going from preaching to meddling because he tackles this subject of anger. Now think about it. As he begins to move out of the introduction into the body of his sermon, he could have tackled any subject, right? Anything would have been appropriate. He could have talked about anything. And yet what does he do? He deals first with anger. And perhaps that's because that's a sin that many of us struggle with. Here in verse 21, he says, you have heard what was said to our ancestors, the Israelites, the 10 Commandments, Mount Sinai, wilderness, all that. You shall not commit murder. Do not murder. And that whoever murders will be subject to judgment. The opening phrase, you have heard, alerts us to the fact that Jesus is quoting from the Old Testament. And then he reminds them of this penalty here. You have heard that it was said. He quotes the 6th commandment, you shall not commit murder, and then tells us the penalty. You shall be liable to judgment, to the courts. At this point, I'm sure that Jesus' listeners are saying, yep, we got this one covered. Check that box, Jesus. We're good. We're not murderers. We know we're not supposed to murder anybody. We've heard this one before, Jesus. We've behaved. We're not guilty. We're good, moral, ethical people, right? So preach on, preacher. You have to admit, it's always more comfortable when the preacher is talking about other folks, right? Man, I wish so-and-so was here today so they could hear this. You've probably heard people say, maybe even yourself, I'm not a bad person. I mean, I've never killed anybody. Even as Christians, it's easy for us to be smug at this, isn't it? It's easy to think that since we have not physically murdered anyone, this commandment really doesn't apply to us. But Jesus undoes that thinking here, doesn't he? He presses this sixth commandment inward, and he drops a preaching bomb, if you will. He drops the mic. Look at verse 22. He says, "But I tell you, everyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment." The court. Whoever insults his brother or sister will be subject to the court. Whoever says, "You fool," will be subject to hellfire. Jesus here begins by saying, "But I say to you." He's affirming everything in the Old Testament. Remember, we saw last week, he didn't do away with it. He's fulfilling it. He's filling it to the full, as we said last week. So what was implicit in the Old Testament law, Jesus here is making explicit. He's giving insight into the original purpose of God's law, a purpose that had been lost to all the rabbis and teachers and Pharisees over the generations, all the way up to Jesus' day. Jesus is saying, I'm going back to the very heart of the law to show you how you are to live out its deepest meanings. And so what Jesus does here is that he moves from the fruit of murder to the root of murder. It's an evil heart attitude. Jesus here is insisting that we are all guilty of murder because we have all been angry in our words, our thoughts, our attitudes, our actions at some point or another. So what he's basically saying is that even though you and I have maybe refrained from physical murder, it doesn't impress God. It doesn't impress him in the least. On the contrary, where does God look? Now, in a different context, in speaking to Samuel, he says, I look not on the outward appearance, but I look at the heart, right? God looks upon our hearts. An unrighteous anger can render one of us to the subject of God's judgment. The term court or judgment, the Supreme Court here, refers to God's heavenly court, since there's really no human court that can be able to understand a person's heart. They can't try a case on somebody's internal anger. And so Jesus here goes even further when he states that the offender is guilty enough to go to hell. Have you ever been angry? Whether it's through your words or your thoughts, your attitude or action. Have you ever been angry with another person? See what Jesus says here. You deserve to go to hell. Fortunately, the good news is that Jesus died for that. Jesus' death has made salvation to all those who will believe. If Jesus hadn't paid for your sin and my sin with his death, you and I would spend eternity in hell, not just for murder, but for even speaking or thinking insults. And so this is why it's important that we nurture and esteem our relationships. And let's break down these insults very quickly here. Basically what he says here is if anyone says to you, insults their brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Whoever insults his brother or sister will be subject to the court. Whoever says you fool will be subject to hellfire. Basically what he's saying is good for nothing. Raka. If anyone says raka, you are pronouncing judgment and insult on someone. Even the word itself sounds nasty, doesn't it? I can't do it with the true guttural sounds of Hebrew, but it almost sounds like you're about to hock a loogie in somebody's face. Raka. And in Jesus' day, raka was an Aramaic insult that basically meant something like this. Not a literal translation. It's my translation. You worthless son of a motherless goat. You brainless blockhead. You empty-headed fool. You idiot. You imbecile. You probably get the idea, don't you? You use this colorful description, raka, when you're angry and you wanted to attack a person's self-worth and dignity. The same is true with saying you fool. The word behind fool is the Greek noun moros, where we get moron from. In Jesus' day, moros was used to describe a person's mental abilities. It was also used to describe a person's moral character. So if you refer to somebody as moros, you're basically calling that person a stupid liar, a stupid cheater, a stupid infidel. It's an insult on somebody's morals as well as their character. Although raka and moros seem to be synonymous, raka seem to express contempt for somebody. Perhaps his head, his intellect. Moros is more about his heart, his character. Now here's the thing. Name calling in Jesus' day is far more serious than it is in our day, because theirs was an honor and shame society. Most people had little to trade except for their honor, and to belittle another person's honor publicly was a serious matter. If a person loses his or her good reputation, it's about the same as dying. So Jesus seems to be saying that when you treat people as nothing by calling them names, you have in fact already murdered them. Character assassination is just another form of murder. Now, it's interesting what Jesus does here. He includes this phrase with his brother or with his sister. Isn't it true that our anger tends to flare up most often against those we know best and love the most? I'll admit it. I lose my anger with my family much more than I do with those that are in my community. You'll probably never hear an angry word out of me, but my family will. We tend to have little patience with the ones that we're closest to. Yet Jesus' primary concern is our relationship with those who are our brothers and sisters in Christ. He cares about how we treat our spouse, our children, our siblings, other believers. In Colossians 3:19, Paul was going to write, "Husbands, love your wives and do not be embittered against them." And although this verse is directed towards husbands, it's applicable to wives as well. We need to stop our guilt trips, our fault finding, our name calling, our yelling, our sarcasm, and our blaming. Again, speaking to husbands, Peter says that if we don't treat our spouse with love and respect, our prayers will be hindered. In Ephesians, Paul says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." As parents, we need to make sure that we show our children God's love and compassion. In 1 Timothy, Paul says, "Therefore I want the men in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without wrath and dissension." What this means is that I need to be able to pray that I forsake ungodly anger. If I'm angry, my fellowship with God is affected, and not in a good way. My prayers will lack power. And so the next time that we get angry at one of our loved ones, those that are closest to us, we need to think long and hard before cursing them. Don't be lulled into thinking that it's no big deal if we lose our anger at those around us. It is a big deal. So does that mean that every expression of anger is a sin? No. Jesus got angry, didn't he? Both he and Paul called people fools. But in their situations, it was not some flippant name calling. Jesus and Paul labeled people fools because they blindly allowed their religious practices to distort their lives with God. So they were basically making statements of fact. Moreover, Jesus got angry in the Gospels. He got angry when he cleaned the temple out. He got angry with those who assailed him for healing on the Sabbath. And yet his anger is not a personal attack in those situations. When he's angry, he is angry at injustice and sin. He exercised righteous anger. We ought to be able to and should exercise righteous anger. We ought to be angry with abortionists, drug peddlers, pornographers, racists, vicious world dictators. When others are perverting and destroying God's purposes, we ought to have a sense of righteous indignation. Unfortunately, the majority of us as Christians don't struggle with righteous anger. We tend to struggle with unrighteous anger. So how do we get a grip on it? Consider the following suggestions. Admit to yourself and God that you have an anger problem. Don't make excuses for yourself. Don't pawn your sin off on your family of origin. Just own it. And after you have confessed your sin, ask God to change you from the outside, for the inside out. Be patient with God's work in your life. It's not going to happen overnight. It can, but most of the time, you didn't get there overnight. It's going to take you a while to work through it. Anger may be your besetting sin, something that you always will struggle with until you meet Jesus face to face. But it just means that you need to pray for self-control. You need to pray for plenty of grace from God and others. Memorize and utilize James 1:19. But everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger, for the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. Recognize the consequences of your angry outburst. I mean, as we talked about earlier, there are just some things we don't need to say and should not say at all. You're fat. You're ugly. You're stupid. I hate you. When words like these escape our mouths, the consequences are severe. We can't take them back. It's like the old illustration of trying to put toothpaste back in the toothpaste tube, right? I mean, we grew up saying sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt us. That's the biggest lie from hell, isn't it? Whoever came up with that phrase ought to be tongue lashed. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. But we ought to daily rehearse this mindset. Understanding the relational damage that hateful words create. Words that are hard to forget. Perhaps you still remember angry words that were spoken to you decades ago. I know I do. So hold off sending that critical email or text. If you have something good to say, put it in writing. But if you have something bad to say, see them face to face. Deal with the issues of anger privately. Christians often assume that they need someone to talk to about their anger directed towards another person. That can create opportunities for gossip and slander. Sometimes we even justify it under, hey, I'm praying for them. There are consequences for angry words. We have to remember that we're going to stand before the Lord one day and give account for every word that we have uttered. That ought to scare the heck out of us. Later in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is going to go as far as to say that we're going to have to give an account. And that's over in Matthew 12. And so in Psalm 52, David states that our tongues devise destruction and we can liken to a sharpened razor. You ever been around a razor? I know at least one of us has. Those things are sharp, aren't they? They can cut you in an instant. Our words can slice and dice people, just like a razor can our bodies. We have to always be cautious and sensitive to others. We're called to nurture and esteem our relationships. I mean, let's face it, there's just some people that are going to push our buttons, right? They actually go out of their way to push our buttons. They know you best, and they know how to get under your skin. So expect that there are going to be times that you get ticked off. There are going to be times that you're going to be angry, when you want to explode. Here's my thing. I have to be conscious about my facial expressions. Again, you might not hear that word come out of my mouth, but my face doesn't tend to hide it. And those facial expressions can get us into trouble. You ever heard the phrase, looks can kill? There's a reason for that. Or how about our tone? That's the lovely thing about text and email nowadays, that you can't hear somebody's tone in what they're writing. My tone is probably what gets me in trouble with Jennifer more than anything else. Just yesterday, I was messing around with her, and she took it the wrong way, you know. All of that comes into play. Proverbs 15:1 says, a soft answer turns away wrath. We need to watch how we speak. We need to watch our gestures. Let's stick our hands deep down into our pockets when we get angry. That might keep you from clenching your fist or drawing back or giving them the hello signal from Hawaii, right? Or pushing somebody. You really can't hurt anybody with your hands stuffed down in your pockets. If you feel like you're going to get out of control and all of that's going to fail, all the other options, then run. Flee the scene. Walk away. There's a reason that we were told to count to 10 as kids. Jesus says we have to recognize the danger of unrighteous anger. And so that begs the question, why is this so important? Because unrighteous anger is on par. It's at the same level. It's seen by God the exact same way as physical murder itself. But here's the thing, Jesus isn't done with us yet. I mean, we thought that was hard enough. We're not only to just rein in our anger, we also have to reconcile with those who are angry at us. And that's what we see in the other couple of verses here. We don't just have to control our own anger, we have to reconcile with those who are angry with us. And he gives us two illustrations to talk about the seriousness of anger. The first one is in a worship context. The second one is in a legal setting. And so in these verses, Jesus here changes from using the words everyone to you. He wants to make sure every disciple applies what he says directly to himself or to herself. And so his first illustration here, Jesus says reconciliation takes precedence even over our worship. Notice what he says there in verse 23. So if you are offering your gift on the altar, and there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled with your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Notice the word here, first. Jesus here is speaking about the priority of reconciliation. reconciliation is important enough to even interrupt worship. Harmonious relationships with people must be in place before any true worship can take place. Where Jesus says presenting your offering at the altar, what he's talking about is the sacrifice that's being offered at the temple in Jerusalem. Now, he's in Galilee, mind you. So he's envisioning a worshiper who has traveled some 80 miles from Galilee down to Jerusalem to offer up his offering. It's going to be a sacrificial animal. And so think about what he's saying here. This person is to leave this animal on the altar, make a week-long journey back home to reconcile with his brother or sister, and then come back and worship. The improbability of this scenario emphasizes Jesus' point that we must deal with strained relationships. We are called to nurture and esteem our relationships. And notice here, Jesus makes an important distinction in this verse. He says, if your brother or sister has something against you. The phrase something against you is implying a just claim. So in other words, their concern with you, their anger with you, their problem with you is legitimate. It's justified. You have sinned against them. You have angered them. And so they are rightly angry with you. Jesus is saying here, if they have something against you, you need to deal with it. He didn't say if you have something against your brother or sister, did he? Why is that? Why wouldn't he say if you have something against your brother or sister? Because his expectation is that we let it go. We let it go. If we're angry with somebody else because of something they've done, that's on us to forgive. If somebody has done something to offend you, you are to forgive them as a follower of Jesus. Because if you can't forgive them, basically what you're saying is that what they've done to you is worse than what you've done to Jesus. Jesus is able to pray from the cross, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And so if we're unable to forgive, we're in essence saying that that sin against us is worse than how we've sinned against God. You forgive them. You settle the issue before God. If there's something about that person that makes it hard for you to be slow to anger, something you just don't like about him and her, we're called to overlook it. Proverbs 19:11 says, a man's discretion makes him slow to anger, and it is his glory to overlook a transgression. Now, of course, if another believer has done something seriously sinful that has caused you harm or has caused harm to others, Jesus gives us some examples there of what to do. Matthew 18. He tells us how to approach that person who has sinned against us. In this context here, though, Jesus says that some believers should not attend church until they have pursued reconciliation. And yet every single week, professing Christians gather to sing songs, listen to sermons, take communion, present offerings, even pray while they are harboring anger in their heart. And true and proper worship is done in spirit and in truth, and is dependent upon a group of worshipers who are reconciled to each other as well as their neighbors, particularly within the church. The second illustration that he gives to us stresses the importance of making things right quickly. He urges us to have a sense of urgency when it comes to reconciling with an opponent, most likely somebody that's outside the church. Notice what he says there in verse 25. Reach a settlement quickly with your adversary while you're on the way with him to the court, or your adversary will hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out of there until you have paid the last penny. This illustration assumes that you owe a debt to someone. And to collect on it, this individual is taking you to court. Jesus is saying, don't wait till you get to court to work this out. Settle it outside of court, because the judge could rule against you. And if it rules against you, you're going to be thrown into debtor's prison, and you won't get out until every penny of that debt is paid for. Now just think about that for a moment. You're in prison until the debt is paid in full. If you're in prison, how can you pay back the debt? It's impossible. So if you've offended somebody, it's your responsibility to quickly do what you can do to make it right. That means you approach that person and you say, I was rude to you. I was wrong. I'm sorry. I took advantage of your kindness. I borrowed money and I didn't pay it back. But here's a small payment and I'll pay you the rest when I can. I make a promise to you that I didn't keep. I was wrong. Please forgive me. If there is someone out there that you have sinned against, it's your job to reconcile with that person. It's interesting that Jesus here stated a practical reason to reconcile with one's enemies, to avoid being thrown into prison. In other words, what he's saying is don't wait till it's too late. Don't put it off till tomorrow or next year or even when the kingdom fully comes. Make peace with others now. Because in the long run, it's just going to hurt you. And it's going to hurt your witness. A root of bitterness can creep in and overtake you. And so in both of these illustrations, it's worth noting that Jesus seems to expect conflict. He's not saying if it happens. He's saying when it happens. And let's face it, we live as fallen humans in a fallen world. There's going to be conflict, isn't there? The point here is not so much to eliminate that conflict, but to resolve it. He doesn't say if you're being sued, shame on you, or if your brother has something against you, shame on you. He knows conflict is going to happen. So the focus here is on resolution. That's why we're called to nurture and esteem our relationships. And perhaps you're even thinking in this moment, hey, listen, I have tried. I have tried and tried and tried to reconcile. I've tried and tried and tried to be nice. But the other person is just as unwilling. That other person just does not want to work with me. That other person is just continuing to do these things. Here's a word for you as well. If you have done everything in the supernatural power of the Holy Spirit to reconcile, you've honored God. You have done your due diligence. You have done what you're supposed to do. If you have tried to reconcile and it's the other person that doesn't want to bring reconciliation, that's on them. You can't make them accept your apology. You can't make them live in peace with you. You've done what you have been told to do. And Romans 12:18 says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. The willingness to reconcile has to be shared by all parties involved. So don't beat yourself up over this. Don't think that you've done something wrong or God is not happy with you. If you've done everything that you could do, if you have tried to bring reconciliation and it just isn't happening, then give it to God. Leave it in His hands. The main thing is that you make sure that you have done what's right. That you have tried to make everything right. And that your anger, the insults, the self-righteousness has been replaced by humility, by a willingness to reconcile. Don't let that bitterness eat away at you. Sometimes we have hurt people deeply, and it is fully our fault. But when we go and humble ourselves and seek forgiveness, there is a good chance that we're going to be snubbed. There's a good chance that we're going to be snubbed. But Jesus still expects us to at least try. At least try. So again, I must ask you, what have you done about what you can do to be at peace with your antagonist, with your in-laws, with your ex, with your parents, with your children, with your spouse, your coworker, your friend, your neighbor? What have you done to be at peace? If you knew today was your last day here on this earth, and you only had one phone call that you could make, who would you call? What would you say in an effort to be at peace with him? If you have that person in mind, why wait? Why put it off till tomorrow? God calls you and I to nurture and esteem our relationships. Because that's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Let's pray.